Good morning and welcome to Morning Movie News. Now, as we all know, Robert Downey Jr. has said he doesn't want to make any more Iron Man movies and is only signed on for the Avengers 2 and 3. So that gives him some free time. And apparently he's going to use that time to try and rebuild the rest of his career. He had the Sherlock Holmes franchise, obviously, alongside his work with the Marvel Universe. But I think it seems like he wants to get back into making other kinds of films. Now, he's not shying away from, high concept fare, as you're about to hear, but he has an interesting slate coming up, and not with Disney, with Warner Brothers. And I think that speaks to Warner Brothers' strategy of having good relationships with both behind and in front of the camera talent. That's something Jeff Robinov did quite well for the studio, and it looks like the new leadership under Kevin Tsujihara is trying to maintain that. With some of the same personalities, Robert Downey Jr. being one of them. Now, he and his wife, Susan Downey, they have a production company called Team Downey. And I'll talk about that in a moment, the dynamic between Robert Downey Jr. and his wife, because we've spoken a lot here, or I've mentioned to you how I feel about some wives as producers, but I think this is a very unique and good situation with this one. But anyway, they have a first look deal, a development deal with Warner Brothers, and they have multiple projects apparently that they're in the pipeline. The first that's actually coming out in October is called The Judge, and this is a film that they're producing together for Robert Downey Jr. He stars, and it's a comedy drama. You'll see all of these films that he has planned. There are two only that we know of, but they all have very high comedic elements to them, which is obviously one of Robert Downey Jr.'s strong points. The question is, will he get too smirky, too sarcastic? He doesn't want to pull a Johnny Depp, where he kind of overstays his welcome and oversaturates his own market with too many Robert Downey Jr.-y movies. But anyway, it's called The Judge. He plays a lawyer who goes to his hometown for his mother's funeral, only to discover that his father, who's the judge of the town, the lone judge, Robert Duvall, is suspected of murder. And so I don't know what's funny about that, but I'm sure Robert Downey Jr. will find a way. He's made some very good dark comedies. I always recommend Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Very good film. And I have some faith in Robert Downey Jr. I think he has a very good body of work. He's made some missteps, sure, but I would take everything he offers with a grain of salt. For instance, Due Date comes to mind, but I think overall I have trust in Downey's choice of projects. But anyway, that film's coming out in October, and the reason he made the news and the reason we're discussing him today is he just had another project officially given the go-ahead, at least to move to the next stage of development at Warner Brothers, and that's something called Cloaked. Now, it's cloaked in secrecy, whatever this movie is about, but the word is that it's kind of like an American Werewolf in London, in that it's a supernatural horror comedy. So it seems like it has shades of Sherlock Holmes perhaps too. I really wanted Sherlock Holmes to work. I know there's apparently a third one that's being considered, but I had major problems with the Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes franchise. I feel that it's very light on actual mystery, and it's more really the Robert Downey Jr. show, which to some degree I can't complain too much because I do enjoy him, as I said, in this kind of work, but again, he doesn't want to pull a Johnny Depp where he just does too much of it. So those are the films that he's working on for Team Downey, for Warner Brothers, The Judge and Cloaked. So Cloaked is moving, I think, to the script stage. But let me speak to Team Downey for a moment. I recently talked about the fact that I felt Zack Snyder's wife, Christopher Nolan's wife, these women are their husbands' producers. They only produce their husbands' films, and I question whether or not they were true producers are really only a second vote for their husbands, because a lot of the films they've worked on together have problems where you're like, well, I think maybe if you were a good producer who was not biased, you would perhaps be able to step back and see these problems and alert your better half that they were making a mistake. But I don't know what the dynamics are with those relationships. But I felt that it downgraded the role of producer a little bit to where it was really like the director's wife/assistant. Instead of, a powerful entity in its own right, which a producer is. A producer is a wonderful profession, and I would hate to see women like that discouraging any other women from going into the profession, and also from trying to be powerful producers, who stand on their own. But Susan Downey, I think, is a really interesting and unique situation. She, of course, worked for Joel Silver, and she was someone who helped Robert Downey Jr. really with his comeback, and both professionally and personally. And he really is very vocal about thanking her for her faith in him, and she has done a lot to get him back on the right path again, professionally and career-wise. It's no secret that Robert Downey Jr. has had extensive drug addiction problems, and was a fixer-upper. But Susan Downey, his wife now, took on that project almost a little bit like Camilla Alice or Matthew McConaughey. People have spoken to the fact that he was a bit of a mess when she first met him, and it's also said that she's done quite a bit to rehabilitate him, both personally and professionally, and really to inspire him to make this leap that McConaughey has. And so you're seeing the same with Downey Jr. And I think that both Robert Downey Jr. and Matthew McConaughey are good examples of their wives being good partners that aren't just yes women, but really contribute to the relationship and move it forward and bring something to the table. And of course, Susan Downey has left Joel Silver and her own producing projects, and now she works solely with Robert Downey Jr. to make these films and to further his career and to some degree her own. I guess you could question why she would want to just go into business with just her husband. What if they ever get divorced? You never know what could happen. There are a lot of ugly divorces in Hollywood for this kind of reason. But so far, so good. I think it's certainly worked out well for both of them. And if they have the kind of relationship where they can live together and work together, and I guess it helps that he's often on location, they seem to be putting out good content. And again, it's been good for, at least I can't speak to what it's done for Susan because she's not a public figure, but for Robert Downey Jr., it's obviously helped him tremendously in every aspect of his life. So that's one of the good. He and Matthew McConaughey, I think, have some of the good working relationships in Hollywood that I think are quite commendable. So that's the first story of the day. What Robert Downey Jr. is up to outside of his Avengers work. Do you like it? Do you think that it's worth taking him away from his time as Tony Stark? Or do you think it's not a good trade-off and you just want him to make more Iron Man movies? All right, so again, that's the first story of the day. On to the second. Speaking of relationships with Warner Brothers, one such person who has a relationship as well is Baz Luhrmann. He did very good work for them, I feel, with The Great Gatsby. Wasn't a huge awards contender, as I'm sure they would have liked and probably expected, but it still did very well at the box office, particularly overseas. It was Baz Luhrmann's most successful film to date. It did walk away with some Oscars, I believe, for something in design. Catherine Martin, another great Hollywood husband-wife team. She is his partner both professionally and personally. She does all the production and costume design for the basic look of a Baz Luhrmann film. Comes from his wife, Catherine Martin. Very good duo. And there she is recognized for her contributions on her own. So they have a very good relationship with Warner Brothers, and it looks like Warner Brothers, even post-Robinov, is interested in continuing with that. And the rumor is the film that they're discussing, that they're going to tackle next, is an Elvis Presley bio. I think that's a phenomenal idea. A number of news sites pointed out that Catherine Martin could really go to town, especially with the Las Vegas portion of Presley's life. But I think that this is really perfect for Baz Luhrmann, not just because of his wife, who's a wonderful visual creative talent for film, but because his work with musicals, Moulin Rouge, I think Strictly Ballroom, right? I think that was his, some ballroom dancing movie. He does a very good job of incorporating popular songs, not original songs, but popular songs. And Great Gatsby, I loved the soundtrack for Great Gatsby. It ended up being very controversial for the film, and I think to some degree, or actually, inarguably hurting it. Who knows how the film would have done and performed if he hadn't taken that risk. I respect him for taking the gamble, and it just didn't pay off here. I thought it paid off, and I think people are divided on that. I'm sure there are some people who are, like myself, liked the work that Baz Luhrmann and Jay-Z did with the Great Gatsby soundtrack. But anyway, Baz Luhrmann himself has a wonderful relationship with music and film. And of course, he could do a lot with Elvis Presley's soundtrack, his body of work. And I think you can have a really fascinating film. I don't know very much about Elvis Presley. I never actually have to say, I've never really been a fan of Elvis Presley's music, although I forget that he did this one romantic song. I wish I remembered the name of it. A real, I guess what you would call a crooner. And it really captured my imagination. For once, I got Elvis Presley. It was really romantic. His voice sounded great. And it hooked me emotionally. And that was the first time I ever, as I said, got Elvis Presley and understood to some degree what the fuss was about. But he definitely has his fan base. I mean, Graceland is a major tourist attraction. His home now turned into a place you can visit, that you can visit yourself. I'm sure they would love it if they made an Elvis Presley movie. It would really, re-energize interest in the king. But there's a great story to be told there, and I think that Baz Luhrmann could do a phenomenal job with it. Now, they're saying they don't know what portion of his life it would cover. I hope it covers most of his life. I'm really tired of these snapshot biographies. And they can be effective, but I think sometimes they miss telling us someone's story, and I think that can be great. I would rather watch a 3-hour Baz Luhrmann Elvis Presley bio, which incorporates his music and shows how he started out as this 1950s, teen idol and morphed into this lounge act in a sequin jumpsuit in Las Vegas. That's fascinating. That's a really great path. And I guess you could kind of speak to that a little bit if you just maybe covered him in his Vegas days. But I'd rather see the transition unfold before my eyes on screen. And it would be great to see the visual transformation as well. So is that a great role for an actor or what? I think that's also, we'll see who gets that. But I'm sure some people are putting it on their radar already. So I think that sounds like a great property. And I'm glad that Baz Luhrmann is, even though Gatsby didn't deliver quite as Warner Brothers and he had hoped, that they still have faith in him and they're going to move forward with him in some capacity. So that's the second story of the day. The third story of the day, I almost didn't cover this because I have to say I'm getting a little bit superheroed out. All these superhero movies are coming out there, and each one is so overcrowded that I'm just kind of like, whoa, guys, let's take a breather. So I'm actually kind of glad that no superhero movies come out next weekend so we can kind of just catch our breath. But anyway, I felt let's discuss it because I think it speaks to this fatigue that might be setting in. So early, too. We just started summer and we're tired of superhero movies already. That is very scary news for Hollywood and the rest of the summer slate. But anyway, the news is that Tim Blake Nelson has been cast in the FF movie, the Fantastic Four movie that's coming out from Fox. And he's playing Harvey Elder, a.k.a. Mole Man. But word is that he won't be Mole Man in this movie. He's just an Easter egg, again, for fans in the know to be like, that's going to be the Mole Man, to hopefully show up for a sequel. Now, first off, let's talk about Tim Blake Nelson. I feel he's a character actor who had his shot, didn't quite work out. I think that casting him is an unfortunate. Not only I think he's not a hot property right now, but I think it's an unfortunate reminder of his work in The Incredible Hulk. Of course, the Edward Norton version, where he played Samuel Stearns, a.k.a. the leader. I think one of the weakest parts of that movie, Edward Norton being the strongest, although not the strongest behind the scenes, which is why he's no longer the Incredible Hulk. But anyway, I don't know why you would want to have a callback to a film that didn't work out, where he played another villain, and a very similar villain. I think Tim Blake Nelson is guilty of kind of chewing the scenery. He's a very B-level actor, in my opinion. So I think that's a very questionable casting choice, especially when they're doing a reboot themselves. They want to try and cast off. They have their own cobwebs to cast off. Why take on another franchises? So I don't like the casting. The other problem I have is that this idea that they're planning teases already. Like, is he only going to be like in one scene? Like, we're talking about Cyborg, Ray Fisher. How much is he going to be in Superman versus Batman? And I talk about this later today. You'll see in my Spider-Man reviews for The Amazing Spider-Man. And then I think there's such. I'm gonna basically, quote myself. There's such an arms race to build cinematic universes in different studios that the stories themselves are getting lost in that. And then I think these studios are so concerned with, Easter eggs and teases and teasing movies coming up and characters coming up, that is actually your A storyline instead of something that should really be a background that's an addition. That should be the cherry on top, not the entire sundae. And so I think there's a real shifting of priorities, which is actually detrimental to the superhero genre. So I'd be curious to how you guys feel. When you already hear of a teaser being built into this new Fantastic Four, are you like, yes, I love it when they do this? Or are you like, hold on, I don't even know if I like the Fantastic Four, and you're already trying to get me excited about a sequel? I feel that a lot of us are having that same problem with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which you'll see in my reviews. So that's the third story of the day. So now on to the viewer question. This comes from the Brown Knight. And the Brown Knight says, hi Grace, this also kind of speaks to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is why I picked it today. So the Brown Knight says, hi Grace, this is my first question. So anyways, I was wondering, why does Warner Brothers DC not make a film that's based on a comic book graphic novel? Basically adapt a well-known story, kind of like the animation department does so often. So the Brown Knight continues saying, I personally feel that Batman Earth 1 by Jeff Johns should be adapted because it's a fresh take on Batman. Maybe they can make Jeff Johns write the screenplay for a standalone Batman film with Ben Affleck playing that role. Just a thought, says the Brown Knight. I hope you can answer this question on Morning Movie News. Smiley face, because I know you like smiley faces. I do like smiley faces, and your question has been picked for Morning Movie News. Not only because I think it speaks to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, something that I have a problem with that film, but also that you mentioned Batman Earth 1. Phenomenal comic book standalone story. They are making a sequel. It's a graphic novel that came out about, I'd say maybe a year ago at this point. It's really good. It does make a lot of changes to the Batman mythos, I think for the better. I think they're very interesting, fascinating choices that are well worked out. And the Jeff Johns' story takes its time, so they seem very organic. I would love to see that be a movie. But I don't know if that'll ever happen. I do have to say, though, I think that what I'm hearing with Jeffrey Irons being cast as Alfred Pennyworth, that you are actually seeing seeing Geoff Johns' ideas in Batman Earth 1 carried over into the mainstream Batman cinematic universe and the Batman animated universe. As you might recall, the latest Batman, Beware the Batman animated series, also has an Alfred taken from the Batman Earth 1, where he has a military background. So I think there are a lot of good ideas. I don't even want to give them away. There's one involving Martha Wayne, which I thought was brilliant. One of the greatest ideas I've ever seen come up with in comics, and I am a big Batman fan, so I really take it seriously. So when you make a change, I really put my guard up, and I embrace this change fully. So I highly recommend everyone read Batman Earth 1, and so I partly picked this question to plug it, because it's such a great comic. And at a time when DC Comics are, I think, not up to snuff, this is a great way to remind yourself of how good they can be, and how good Geoff Johns can be. I feel his writing is also not up to snuff lately, but this is just stellar work. Some of the best work he's ever done. And Geoff Johns has done some very good work. But as to your question, The Brown Knight, about adapting already known graphic novels and stories, I'm actually against it, and I'll tell you why. On the one hand, I think they can almost never compare. For instance, the animated movies that they come out now. I much would prefer for these to be original stories. I still, to this day, remember the Batman Beyond Return of the Joker animated movie, which was very dark and fascinating, and Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Those were great movies, great animated movies that were original stories, and they both featured very dark elements to them that were very, very impressive. And so I think that those were fantastic, and as I said, still remember to this day. Yet I feel today, when we see an animated movie, we instantly compare it to the comic book, and I feel it's repetitive. It does nothing to spark our interest or to get us talking, because the conversation really just stays in the category of, was this a good adaptation? And I feel it hardly ever is, because a comic book has multiple issues. It's like TV versus movie. It's adapting a TV series into a movie, and things get lost in translation. It just doesn't work. So that's another. And I feel that the animated content is much less sophisticated than the comic book stories they're trying to adapt. So I have a huge problem, and I feel adapting already existing stories has in large part ruined DC's animated brand. So I much would rather, as I said, they make the original stories like we all remember from the Batman Mask of the Phantasm and Batman Beyond Return of the Joker. Really good stuff. If you've never seen those films, I recommend you go and watch those as well. I'm giving you a lot of homework today, but trust me, you're going to really enjoy this homework. Now, as for the movies, the reason I think this ties into The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is I think The Amazing Spider-Man, this whole rebooted franchise, and Spider-Man, I think, yeah, I was going to say in general, but no, because a lot of people weren't familiar with Spider-Man until the first Raimi trilogy. But after all the countless animated series and the comics and and Raimi's trilogy, Spider-Man is an extremely well-known story at this point, where I think even the most casual fan is very aware of Spider-Man's history. So the problem with the reboot is that we come into the theater basically just killing time. Like it's a checklist that the movies have to hit and that we're waiting for them to hit. And there's no surprises. And I feel it's a similar problem. Just like with the animated movies, our conversation turns to, well, was this a good adaptation? That's what you see happening with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Was this a good adaptation of this famous, iconic comic book story? If you want to know my answer to that, you can check out my spoiler review later today. So I really think that both the movies and the comics should stay to original material, and that way they can coexist. They don't have to, suck the life out of one or the other. The comics can tell great stories there, and the great stories on the movies, great stories on the animated series, on the animated movies, etc. And then we all win, because it just means more great stories. I don't see why we would have one great story and then just retell it a bunch of times until it gets watered down to the point where it's almost unrecognizable and you just kind of look at it with pity. I'd rather have 4 original stories than, as I said, one that's repeated 3 additional times. But that's my take on this. I know a number of you do enjoy the animation adaptations. So I'm curious to how you feel. Do you want adaptations of these classic stories, or do you want to see, original stories? Although I'm sorry, I got distracted there for a moment because I had one other point I want to make. I would say that when it works when you're retelling, let's say, the origin of a character, I think it works when you change up the story. I really liked some of the changes, not only that Geoff Johns makes, let's say, in Batman Earth 1, but I thought Nolan made a lot of changes to the Batman mythos that I also thought worked very well. I liked where he was going with The Dark Knight Rises. Again, didn't have enough time, he was rushed, he couldn't fully explore the choices he made, but I liked the choices. I liked the choices that David Goyer made to some degree in Man of Steel, the changes that he made. I thought those were interesting. So I want to so put an asterisk that I want original stories, not adaptations. But if you're going to retell an origin or retell a certain story, then change it. Make it your own. Have the cinematic universe be a little bit different than the comic book universe. Now, I know that doesn't work great to synergy because you want, obviously, customers to go and buy everything and to be tied into all different aspects. And if you make them different, you will have that crossover appeal. But I don't know how much crossover there is. And again, at the end of the day, it's just more good stories with the characters who fundamentally don't change. So that's that's morning movie news. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please write down below what you think of today's 3 top stories, the viewer question, and anything you'd like to see covered on Monday, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.